Good news, Marketplace of Ideas listeners. There is now an official Marketplace of Ideas mailing list, and I'm opening it up to the best of the best listeners. Give me an email at colin@colinmarshallradio.com. That is COLIN at colinmarshallradio.com if you'd like to be added, and I'll add you in there. You can get information straight to your email inbox about interviews coming up, current interviews, past interviews, interesting stuff on the web related to those interviews, and more. That's the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. Email me at colin@colinmarshallradio.com if you'd like to be added. Thanks. This week it's a conversation with Darcy Paquet, founder of Koreanfilmorg and author of New Korean Cinema Breaking the Waves on the Marketplace of Ideas. Cultural conversation of the depth you demand. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I am your man of letters and sound waves, Colin Marshall. Darcy Paquet is a film critic and instructor at Kyunghee University, the founder of Koreanfilmorg, a site I visit pretty much daily, and the author of New Korean Cinema, Breaking the Waves. Darcy, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
On the cover of your book, and the first movie you mentioned in your book as well, is the movie I think U.S. or maybe even the whole English-speaking world's film viewers are most likely to be familiar with as far as Korean films go. It's Park Chan-wook's Oldboy, and this is a film that everybody seems to have a fairly strong reaction to, and they'll often mention, oh geez, it's kind of tied up with Korean history and politics, isn't it? Or it's got these grotesque elements to it. And it seems like kind of an odd Korean film to break through to the rest of the world so solidly. Why do you think such a film got such purchase in the outside world?
Well, it's interesting. I think that, this is a very intense movie, and I think in some ways, perhaps it represents some of the strengths of contemporary Korean cinema. It's a very stylish film. Visually, it's very creative. It is a very intense film. The acting is intense. The story develops quite quickly. And this director, Park Chan-wook, I think he has a talent for, tackling his themes in a commercial way, but also the issues that he raises. He takes them very seriously, I think. Many people compare Park Chan-wook and other Korean directors to the works of Quentin Tarantino, and they share some things in common in the sense that both are kind of children of the video generation who grew up watching a wide range of movies, and they're ardent cinephiles. But I think that maybe the difference with Tarantino is that Park Chan-wook, when he brings up these issues of revenge and the extent to which it's permissible for someone to seek revenge, I think he handles these themes in a very, very serious light. He takes them very seriously.
You do write a lot about the different generations of Korean filmmakers in your book. And here, Quentin Tarantino gets thought of as the representative of a certain generation of especially American independent filmmakers. Is Park Chan-wook received as well as this representative of his generation of Korean cinema?
I think he is. There's, generations in Korea, because society has been changing so quickly, the differences between generations are more pronounced, perhaps, in Korean society. And I don't mean just in the film industry. I think in general you see quite noticeable differences between different generations. The generation that Park Chan-wook is a representative of is, in some ways, kind of the most famous generation. If Americans talk about the baby boomers, Koreans often talk about what they call the 386 generation. This is the generation that was, they were students during the 1980s, and they took part in these massive rallies against the government, and which eventually, these rallies were successful in kind of bringing democracy to South Korea. And so they're a very influential generation that kind of, they feel their power to a certain extent. So because they've had so much influence, I think there's a lot of focus on them. And it's probably no coincidence that among contemporary Korean directors, the most famous and the ones that have kind of made the biggest waves have come from this generation as well.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but in the book you write about that generation as being perhaps the first generation of Korean filmmakers that themselves were were cinephiles in a diverse sense, in that they had sampled a lot of other societies' films and used them as influences?
Yeah, it's very interesting because, throughout the 70s and 80s, it was a very authoritarian time, I guess, in Korean society. And if you look at the film industry, the government kept a very tight lid on what kind of films were shown to the general populace. I think that they felt kind of keenly the power of cinema to influence people. And so they wanted very much to keep control over what kind of films people were watching. And in practice, the way that worked is that actually there wasn't great diversity in the films that were screened to the general public. There were a few Hollywood films, maybe 20, 25 Hollywood films released per year. There were a large number of Korean films being made, but if you were growing up in the 70s and 80s, you had to really kind of look around to get a more diverse range of cinema. Park Chan-wook's generation, they did make some efforts during the 80s to kind of locate underground videos, and there were also a couple, like the French and German cultural centers, were really the only places in Seoul where you could go to watch a wide selection of European films. So this generation grew up, I think, with a particular interest in gaining a broader view of cinema. And in the 1990s, when controls on the film industry were released, you ended up having really quite a wide variety of films being screened in theaters. French films, for example, became quite popular with mainstream audiences in the 1990s. The directors of today, they're the directors who kind of grew up in this period when the films that people were watching really diversified. And so you see a wide range of influences on their work.
And if we're talking about this generation and directors like Park Chan-wook, he himself, of course, he did Oldboy, which many people in the U.S. have seen if they're into international film, but I find he also did the second most popular film as among people who aren't necessarily, who haven't been pursuing Korean film, but who watch international film, Joint Security Area, and another one with perhaps a commercial sensibility, but even more so tied up in the events of Korean history and the way the society is today. Is there some quality about, well, in the book, it seems like the films that really get into sort of the mechanics of Korean society and history are the ones that do tend to break out. Is that a kind of ironic in your mind?
Well, in a sense, I think perhaps that the films that have been very popular and influential in Korean society are, Hollywood films have long had strong influence in Korea. When directors set out to make something that would they wanted to distinguish themselves from Hollywood films, and especially when they attempted to make these larger, big-budget films. The whole issue of the Korean blockbuster. What is a Korean blockbuster? They didn't simply want to copy American-style filmmaking. And so when they moved to these bigger-budget type genre films, I think one of the ways that they tried to distinguish themselves from Hollywood films is to focus on these local issues. Joint Security Area is a good example of that because it's set on the border between North and South Korea. It's about this encounter between two North Korean soldiers and two South Korean soldiers that initially is tense, but eventually this friendship develops between them. As we watch the film, it's quite gripping on its own level, but it also makes you think about the relationship between North and South Korea. The timing of this film's release was very good because it opened in 2000, which was just a few months after this historic meeting between the South Korean President Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il from the North. Issues related to North and South Korea were on people's minds, as they often are, and really, Korean films are able to explore these issues in a depth that Hollywood films can't. And so this is one of the things that has perhaps given them an edge over Hollywood films at the box office.
And as well as speaking about edges over Hollywood films, I don't find myself anymore pursuing too many actual Hollywood big-budget films because they just seem to... It feels like anything they put out, I've kind of already seen in some form. But with Korean blockbusters, with big-budget Korean films that are very successful, I'll still watch those, and I get the sense that there's something, some sort of interestingness, I'll call it, still remains even in the most popular, the most glossy Korean films that I've seen. This may just be kind of a selection bias because maybe the ones that make it to me via festivals and via DVDs just happen to be more interesting, and maybe the schlocky stuff is all just stuck over there in Korea. But is there a sense in which that might be true, that Korean blockbusters in general are allowed to be a little more risk-taking or a little more interesting than maybe Hollywood films are?
Well, I would say that to a certain extent, I agree with that idea, that it is perhaps a little bit more possible to take risks in Korean big-budget films than in Hollywood films. That may be changing. As someone who lives in Korea, I can say that as time passes, it does seem that big-budget films are perhaps becoming less interesting as time goes on. And it may have been that there was particularly in the area when big-budget filmmaking was first developing in Korea, so the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was kind of a sense that directors had more freedom to experiment. Producers were perhaps giving them more freedom because they were trying to distinguish themselves from Hollywood films, and they didn't really know what would work with viewers. And in general, I will say that the Korean audience they've been very unpredictable, and I mean that as a compliment. Occasionally, they have sort of latched onto films that you wouldn't expect would be popular, and they've turned them into big hits. And from a viewer's point of view, that's kind of exciting because you can never really expect what the next commercial success will be. And from a producer's perspective, I'm sure it must be frustrating to them on some level, but it's good for the overall diversity of the film industry because they have to keep trying new things. Whenever it seems that some kind of trend is emerging where a certain film becomes popular and then producers may try to copy that film in order to make a successful follow-up to that film. Often it doesn't really work. I've heard other directors from other countries praise the Korean audience for their sophistication. There's Peter Chan, the director from Hong Kong. I got to interview him a few years ago, and he said that personally he had a very high opinion of the Korean audience, and he felt that they watched films in a sophisticated way, and that they were tolerant of a greater deal of experimentation than perhaps audiences from most other countries.
I'll think of a film, a Korean blockbuster like Bong Joon-ho's The Host, which was popular here in America as well, popular by the standards of a Korean film here in America. And of course, it is a monster movie in every sense of the term, but as well, what I noticed about it was that it mixed a range of emotions or moods or feelings, whatever you want to call them, that you wouldn't normally see in a quote-unquote regular monster movie. I mean, in Hollywood, you would say, well, you can't have something be scary like this and then sad like this and then funny like this all in a row in one movie. Those don't go together. That sort of emotional mixing, some people have said, that's just more accepted in Korean storytelling. But do you agree with that?
I would agree with that to a certain extent. I think that this director, Bong Joon-ho, is a very successful director in Korea. He's very respected. And this movie, The Host, was the biggest hit in Korean film history. It sold over 13 million tickets in a country of 48, 49 million people. And so that's almost a third of the population. It's astounding that a film, first of all, could sell so many tickets, but also when you look at the film itself, while being a mainstream film, it's really quite complex in the way that it handles the emotions on screen. And as you mentioned, it does kind of switch suddenly back and forth between different moods where you have a very serious moment that's followed by this kind of biting satire, and then at times it will sort of break into what we might just call, melodrama. And then as you're watching the film, you're experiencing all these different things. And I think that to a certain extent, yes, the mainstream Korean audience, I think, is perhaps more accepting of this type of experimentation in mainstream commercial films than you might find in other countries. People talk about the 1990s as kind of this cinephile era where I mentioned French films. I mean, a lot of European films that didn't get much attention in other countries actually did fairly well in Korea. And so a generation grew up with kind of a very diverse type of cinema. So perhaps it's this background that has made Korean audiences a little bit more accepting of experimentation in films from their own directors.
And one sort of emblem of that, one figure that I think of when I think of someone who's achieved mainstream popularity, perhaps you could call it, and as well as not lost his experimental edge in Korea, would be Kim Ki-duk, who did Spring, Summer, Fall, Winter, and Spring, best known for Here. But he does seem maybe slightly weirder a director than has gained such a high profile in the rest of the world. I mean, first of all, I guess, is he as popular as one might get the impression from seeing his films over in America, in Korea?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, he's a case where he's very famous in Korea, and I mean, he's really a household name, and people have seen him on TV, and he's a very distinctive character. He has a very different background from other Korean directors. Because his films have done well at international film festivals. I mean, there was one year when, in 2004, he won Best Director at the Berlin Film Festival for a movie called Samaritan Girl. And then he shot another film very quickly in the summer, and he won Best Director at the Venice Film Festival for the movie Three Iron. And so because of this success, he's famous in Korea, but his films have not had the commercial appeal of directors like Park Chan-wook or Bong Joon-ho. I mean, he, I think, is perhaps a little bit more provocative for a Korean audience. He grew up in a very working-class background. He had a very sort of difficult childhood. He dropped out of high school. He was working in factories for a time. He was always interested in painting, and so when he was in his 30s, he saved up money and he flew to Paris and spent a couple of years in Paris working as a street painter. But he says that it was at this time of his life when he watched movies in the theater for the first time. So he really kind of forms a contrast to other directors who grew up as cinephiles and who bring that kind of sensibility to their films. I mean, he's a director who, when you watch his films, you do feel, especially in his early films, you feel this sense of conflict between different classes in Korea. I think because he has this very special perspective, he's become quite well known in Korea, but his films also make some viewers uncomfortable.
So he's a celebrity, but at the same time, someone might be interested to watch him appear on a TV program in Korea, but they might say, "Ooh, I don't know if I'm going to necessarily jump right out to his next movie."
Well, it's very interesting. I think that, I mean, in talking to people in Korea, his films don't do that well at the box office. They don't make a lot of money, but occasionally I run into people who maybe don't watch many Korean films, and they say, I'm really not interested in cinema that much, but they say, oh, there's this one director who I like very much, Kim Ki-duk. And so I think he has a broader appeal. His films have a broader appeal than you would guess by looking at the numbers, the number of tickets that he sells. But in general, yes, he's kind of a minority filmmaker in Korea.
Wasn't there a bit of a story you mentioned in the book where he threatened not to put out any more movies domestically if his next film didn't exceed like 300,000 tickets, and he didn't, and he just said, "Forget it, never mind. I'll keep on going."
That's true. I mean, this movie, this is the movie Time, which was released the same year as The Host, actually. And The Host was in theaters at the time that Time received its first press screening. And he's always had a somewhat contentious relationship with the local press and local critics. I mean, he was expressing his frustration at the situation faced by low-budget films. He felt frustrated that his films weren't getting the same kind of marketing push or, support from the industry that a movie like The Host was. And so he did sort of issue this ultimatum. He said that, if this movie doesn't make 300,000 admissions, I'm going to stop making films. And it went all over the press, and it did actually help to promote his film to a certain extent, but it didn't go anywhere near 300,000 admissions. So, but a year later, he made a new film, and mean, at the time when he sort of retracted his statement, he said that he'd found a new producer to work with, and he got the sense that even though it was a small audience, that there was a very supportive, a group of people who were very supportive of his filmmaking, which I think is true. And so he continued to make films from then on.
Now, there's another modern auteur that is my personal favorite, but I'm going to save him for later. I want to first go back to something you mentioned before, and something that's hugely important in the history of Korean film, something that will surprise even people who are fairly well acquainted with Korean film, but maybe don't know the history of the industry. Just the sheer extent of government involvement or controls on the film industry. It's, as you mentioned in the book, I think you say it's the most government-controlled film industry for a time outside of the non-communist world. And I want to ask, why was the government so interested in getting a hand in the film business?
I know, it's quite an interesting question because, at first glance you might look at the film industry and think that, this is escapist entertainment. People go to the cinema just to have a good time, and why should the government really get involved in what kind of, in influencing what kind of films that the populace watches? On the other hand, if you look, I think that the Soviet Union is another example of a government that believed very strongly in the power of film as an ideological tool to influence people's thinking. And South Korea was a place where ideological battles were really quite front and center for the government because it was a divided country. South Korea it had a capitalist system, which was really the opposite of the system that existed in the North. And so, for example, when filmmakers made movies that appeared to criticize capitalism, it was accepted not only as kind of a criticism of the South Korean government, but also the government perhaps suspected them of, preferring the system in the North and kind of indirectly promoting the system in the North. And because there was so much tension between North and South Korea, I think the government wanted very much to control the film industry, what kind of films were being made. And so censorship was very strong in the 70s and the 80s. And really it went much beyond censorship as well. The government dictated how the film industry would be structured, and they structured it in a way that they would be easy to control.
It goes a long way to explain some of the challenges that I know people have encountered when getting into Korean cinema, and at least I know I encountered when getting into it, which is that you can find so much interesting film from the 2000s and so much from the mid-90s onward, but you get earlier and things get pretty thin on the ground as far as what you can find and what you might want to watch. There are a couple gems. You mentioned the movie Chilsu and Mansu in the book, and that's one I've enjoyed from the later 80s, and there was some from the 60s I've seen, and my favorite though of the my favorite Korean film of the sort of seriously locked down time would be one you mentioned a couple times in the book by Kim Ki-young called, I believe, Iado is the pronunciation.
Oh yes.
And that's a super interesting movie, I think, and I'm really surprised that it escaped sort of. How did a movie like that get through all of the obstacles the government was intent on putting in the way of interesting movies?
Well, it's interesting that this is a movie that was based on a novel, and I think in bringing this to the screen, this is a very idiosyncratic director who had a very distinctive style, and he changed the book quite a bit. He basically, I think, rewrote the story. This is a film that it's set on an island off the coast of Korea, and he kind of portrays the society in the island as being very much a contrast with the modernizing society on the mainland. So in doing this, he sets up this opposition between kind of science and technology and efforts to kind of develop society in a more modern way with the more traditional kind of primitive society on the island. And when these clashes happen, modernity loses. And so it is kind of an indirect swipe at the government's efforts. In the 70s, the government was very focused on modernizing the economy, and they had this campaign to modernize the countryside as well. It can be read as an indirect criticism. It's really interesting because when this film was made, first of all, it had a very low profile, and I think that because it wasn't a film that was widely released or seen by a lot of viewers, it was able to escape some attention from the government. I mean, it was incidentally censored when it was released in Korea. And we have the uncensored version now because it was exported to Japan at the time. And so, like, a complete print existed in Japan. It was sort of common at that time if you wanted to criticize the government, you had to be very indirect about it. There were ways to get around it to a certain extent, but if filmmakers wanted to really comment directly on what things were like in contemporary South Korea, to do it in a critical way, it was very difficult to do that.
Now, from what you know, are there a lot of movies as interesting as Iado that are from the 60s and 70s and 80s in Korean cinema, and that we just can't find them, or that it's hard for people outside of Korea to find them, or are there only a few and we can get them? I guess, are there a bunch that are hidden, or are there just a few that we happen to have found and those are it as far as what's interesting from that time?
I mean, for me personally, I do find a lot of films from this era that I'm quite interested in and that I'm impressed by. I think one of the reasons that it's difficult for these films to see these films from outside of Korea is because they were made during a time when filmmakers were working with materially. It was a very difficult situation for them, and so these films don't look like high quality films. They're shot really inexpensively with poor equipment, and these are not the kind of films that tend to be preserved very well for future generations. If we contrast Korea to a situation like Japan, I think that, there's so many fantastic directors in Japan who made very interesting films all throughout the 50s and 60s and 70s. But they also had kind of more support in the sense that they were able to work with material, they had more material resources when they were shooting the film. And the other interesting issue is that because they were working in these big studios, these days it's much easier to show the films because the companies that made the films still exist. They hold the copyright to the films, and they make an effort to, put them out on DVD and to screen them around the world. In the case of Korea, all the companies that made these older films have all gone bankrupt, and so the copyright is being held by perhaps an elderly producer who is not really actively trying to push the film. And so you really have to kind of search these films out, and when you find them, your first impression may not be very good because they were shot on such low-quality equipment. But the films themselves are quite interesting. If you make the effort, I do think there are a lot of interesting films, but it does require quite a bit of effort.
For these reasons, there's not, say, a Korean equivalent of Yasujiro Ozu.
I think that Kim Ki-young is a good example to look at because I think that in terms of his genius, I think he had as much talent as really any of the other, famous worldwide auteurs from this era. Actually, Park Chan-wook made an interesting comment about Kim Ki-young during a lecture that I heard, and he said that if he had been born in another country, like Spain or Mexico, then he would be famous all around the world today. Because he was born in Korea and he had to work within this system, that he wasn't really able to reach his potential. Even though we have a lot of very interesting films from him, I think that if he'd been able to work with supportive producers, if he'd had kind of an audience that was interested in his work, that he could have done really much more than he did. In terms of talent, I think there are a few examples of very talented Korean auteurs, but the product perhaps is not on the level of an Ozu or a Mizuguchi.
If you've just tuned in, this is The Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. My guest is Darcy Paquet, founder of Koreanfilmorg and author of New Korean Cinema, Breaking the Waves. If you want to hear this show again, visit colinmarshallradio.com, where you'll find the complete Marketplace of Ideas show archive. And if you have any questions, comments, feedback of whatever kind you like, send that on to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. You want to get the show on iTunes? You can. You can subscribe there. Just open up iTunes, go to the iTunes store, and search for The Marketplace of Ideas. You'll find it there, of course, all completely free. Now back to the conversation with Darcy Paquet, founder of Koreanfilm.org, on The Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation at what else but the depth you demand. Now, I mentioned Ozu in the last question, which actually brought to mind a couple quotes that I'd heard about a certain modern Korean director by the name of, I believe, Bong Joon-ho. And he directed the film Christmas in August, I think it was called, and that's one you've cited as being one of the contributors to win you over to Korean cinema, correct? Now, why is that? What about that film was so different than the other cinema to which you had exposed yourself?
I saw this film in 1998 when it was first released in theaters, and it's a melodrama. Korea has a long tradition of melodrama, and yet the way that this film is presented, I think, is quite special in a way. He focuses very much on kind of everyday events. It has somewhat of the feel of Ozu in the sense that this is a film about kind of family dynamics, and it has a bit of the pacing of Ozu. It's a very slowly paced film, and he kind of lets the emotions of the film slowly build up over time. I mean, it feels at the same time very like a very Korean story. The actors, I think, are two of the more interesting actors from that era, and as you get towards the end of the film, it really kind of builds this emotional momentum, and so it is quite a moving film.
You mentioned the word melodrama, which is one that often comes up in discussion of Korean film, I find. Even when I'm talking to Korean people, they will often sort of sheepishly say that, you know, our films are melodramatic, you would call them here. You wouldn't necessarily like that. And in a sense, I think to myself, you know, yeah, when I see something I call melodrama in an American film or in some other film from the English-speaking world, I don't like that. And yet, the Korean films that are called melodramatic, somehow they're presented in a way that is still cinematically appealing to me. Something that, you know, even Japan, when they get melodramatic, I have trouble with. But somehow Korean melodrama ends up being more palatable. That may just be my weirdness. But do you think there's any truth to the fact that Korean cinema handles it a little differently and makes melodrama less sort of a negative thing?
I do get that sense. I think that it's approached in a very serious way melodrama has a higher status, I guess, than it does in other film industries. Korea does have kind of this self-identification with a melodramatic style to some extent that, you know, this is seen as a negative thing, but it's a strength as well. And I think that if we look at the success of Korean cinema in other parts of Asia, for example, one of the things that distinguishes Korean films from other Asian films, and that's allowed them to become popular in other countries, is that they're kind of filling this space. I mean, there's among audiences, there's an interest in melodramatic stories, and Korean films seem to be telling these stories better than anybody else. So, I mean, there is this tradition of melodrama, and that may be part of it. It's also somewhat tied to the TV industry because there's a long tradition of TV dramas that have been in some ways even more successful than the film industry over the years. In terms of film, they're kind of setting themselves up in opposition to the TV industry. And so the melodrama that we see, sometimes it's less overtly melodramatic, or perhaps in a film like Christmas in August, it's a very melodramatic setup, but the way that it's told is a bit more sophisticated and a bit more restrained than you would find on mainstream TV.
And in the settings that you mention, getting won over by Christmas in August and other movies as well, and getting sort of swept up in Korean cinema, you mentioned that it wasn't so much about the movies themselves, but that it was about the Korean attitude towards cinema or Korean cinema culture at that time. What about that fascinated you so much?
Yes, I mean, that was my first impression when I came to Korea. I moved to Korea in 1997. I mean, sometimes people ask me what was the film that first really kind of set you onto Korean cinema. And, I mean, although Christmas in August was one of those early films, I think that what impressed me more than anything was the experience of going to festivals like the Busan Film Festival and seeing such enthusiasm from viewers. Years ago, I spent some time in Moscow, and I got the sense living in Moscow that there was this great interest in theater in that city. You could really kind of feel that just, going around and, seeing what theater productions were available and hearing what people were talking about. And in Korea, it does really seem like cinema is the national art in some sense. It receives a great deal of attention from the populace. And when you go to festivals, you can really sense this enthusiasm for cinema. it was especially so perhaps in the late 1990s when I first came to Korea, but even now you do get the sense that, I mean, when foreign directors come and they present their films at Busan, they're surprised at sort of how many people crowd in to see their films, even if it's a very difficult film, and how young the audience is. At other festivals, it might be a somewhat older audience that, you know, that comes to these type of films, whereas in Korea it's a very young, enthusiastic audience.
This brings to mind another element of Korea and film, not necessarily the film of Korea, that reading about in your book, I was very fascinated by, which is the part where you describe some early screenings of foreign films in Korea when films that are foreign to Korea were starting to initially gain some hold there and gain some screenings. You mentioned that the ticket sales for a film like Abbas Kiarostami's Where is the Friend's Home and one of Tarkovsky's films, I believe Mirror, two of my very favorite directors, actually they did quite well, you know, well than they had done, better than they had done anywhere else. Now, does this fascination with foreign film remain sort of in Korea, even though they've gotten more of their own interesting cinema than ever that's homegrown? Is there still sort of this desire to see the film of other countries?
I think that if you ask most people, they would say that in contrast to the 1990s, I mean, in some ways, local cinema has displaced this. In the 1990s, there weren't a lot of Korean films that were really receiving a lot of attention from the audience. But it was an era when, I mean, people call it the decade of culture. I think that whereas the 1980s, they call it the decade of politics, where people were very focused on political issues. There was a real interest in culture, and you had this kind of a cinephilic mood to that decade. These days, most people would tell you that there isn't as much interest, and yet, I mean, I would argue that it still does remain to a certain extent. You can feel it at certain film festivals. I mean, there is quite a diverse selection of, independent film, foreign film. There's a Cinematheque. There are several places around Seoul that, screen very interesting retrospectives from throughout Korean cinema history. And even though it's not something that the mainstream audience would really focus on to, there is a specialty audience that is very enthusiastic. So to a certain extent, this film culture does exist. Another manifestation of that, if you look at film magazines, especially in the late 1990s, there were 3 weekly film magazines being published for the general reader, plus several monthly magazines. These days, a few of them have gone out of business. It's not the same situation as it was before, but there's still some very interesting magazines that remain, including the big weekly film magazine, Cine 21. Most countries don't really have that. They'll have there isn't enough of an audience to really support a mainstream weekly film magazine.
And it's interesting because, every single day or just about, I see or get sent an article bemoaning the American death of film journalism, the American death of film criticism. And even though a couple film magazines, as you say, have gone out of business in Korea, do you get the sense that there's any of that same worry, like, film criticism is slowly shriveling? It seems like there isn't.
Well, there is this conversation in Korea as well. And I think that the direction may be the same as in the U.S., where, it is kind of, the internet is displacing a lot of traditional print media, including things like film magazines. On the internet, there's, a tremendous amount of discussion related to cinema, but there is a sense that traditional film criticism in Korea is in crisis as well. But the difference, perhaps, I guess, is that it's kind of starting from a higher level, and it hasn't fallen quite to the extent that it has in many other countries.
And speaking of the internet, of course, I mentioned at the top of the interview, and people will know you as well as the founder of Koreanfilm.org, and it's the first place I think anyone curious about Korean film is going to end up, especially because it's going to be at the top of any Google search for Korean film, and because there's so much information there about whatever movie you want to know about, that's probably where you're going to find details about it. And with the sort of perspective that Koreanfilm.org has given you, I want to know, is there anything especially fascinating you've learned being given or having earned the sort of access to the opinions and the interests and the fascinations of Korean film fans, not just in Korea or just in America, but from all over the world? I mean, has anything interesting revealed itself to you about sort of what is fascinating people about Korean film?
Yeah, I do find it really interesting to hear from people who are discovering Korean films in different ways around the world. And you really get the sense that different regions are experiencing it in different ways. Whereas in Asia, it's kind of a much more mainstream audience that's developing an interest in Korean films. Some of them may have become fans of Korean TV dramas, and then through their favorite stars, they come to watch a certain number of Korean films. Whereas in Europe, there are quite a few releases that are kind of they're released as like Asian cult movies or Asia Extreme, is a label that's received.
That's the Korean cinema's been tagged with like the sort of this is where you go to find the most grotesque extreme movies.
Exactly. Yeah, and Korea has these type of movies, and so people might be much more familiar with this type of film from over there. And yet, so I think that because Korean cinema is fairly diverse, and it's been able to maintain a certain degree of diversity up to this point, it's been able to appeal to many different kinds of audiences around the world. I guess one of the big surprises for me is just how far it's penetrated. Very early, I received some emails from people in countries like Myanmar or Mongolia who had developed a strong interest in Korean cinema, and even though it was very difficult at that time to actually access Korean films. And the degree to which it's spread throughout the world has surprised me.
One of the things I like about Koreanfilm.org as well is that there is a certain, you can browse it any way you like, but there is a certain auteur organization to parts of the site, and there's pages for individual directors. Some of the directors we've already mentioned in this discussion as well, but I did allude earlier to the fact that I was waiting to mention my absolute favorite Korean filmmaker. I think the guy who won me over to Korean cinema, and one of my favorite filmmakers working today, maybe my favorite filmmaker under the age of 60 working today. It's Sang Soo, and his films are different than a lot of Korean films I've seen, and I mean that's how they won me over, I suppose. But how are his films different from Korean cinema in general? Just because you have a grasp of the whole sort of range, where do his films actually fit? I mean, saying they're my personal favorites means nothing. What are they in the world of Korean cinema?
He's a very interesting filmmaker, and I like his films a lot. I think he has a very personal approach to filmmaking in general that may separate him from other Korean directors. I mean, he himself, I think, would even go to the extent that, he doesn't really think of himself very strongly as a Korean director, as a director who's really representing Korea. And I think that his relationship with filmmaking is on a very, very personal level. When you talk to him about the process of making a film, he says that he'll take a very simple idea, and he develops it very slowly, and it seems he's almost kind of depending on his unconscious to let the story take shape. He's made quite a few films now. Many of them, for people who are not fans of his work, the common criticism is that many of his films are very similar. They all seem to feature characters that are very similar to himself. He makes films about film directors or artists or other people within an artistic community. There are a lot of scenes where people get together and drinking parties or something that reappears quite frequently in his films. And he does appear to kind of take a lot from his own experiences and put them into the films. Things he overhears in conversation, perhaps between people, might reappear in his works. And at first glance, they appear to be just very ordinary stories about ordinary people. And yet, when you stand back and really kind of look at his films from a distance, you see that they're structured in a very, very interesting way. Things from the beginning of a film might echo segments from the end of the film. If you compare his two different films, you find these really interesting connections between them. It might just be a line of dialogue or or a gesture or something that reappears later. But when you actually sit and you try to kind of trace the relationship between all the elements in the film, you find that he structured it in a very, very interesting way and complex way. And so he's a difficult filmmaker to really understand and appreciate. Although he's very famous and his films do screen at festivals around the world, he's not the kind of director who's won a lot of awards. And I think a lot of people are kind of puzzled by his approach. He hasn't received the same level of recognition that I think he deserves, considering how original his films are. But in Korea, he does have a very strong supportive audience. It's a small audience, but like Ki-duk, he's become fairly well known, and local critics and kind of the small group of audience members, I mean, really do look forward to his next film. They really watch kind of the progression of his career with some interest.
And yes, there is so much to say about the structure of Hong Sang-soo's films, and the critics have written a lot about that, and it's certainly something to appreciate. And there's many technical elements of his films to like, but I mean, personally, I also find them extremely, extremely funny. And they're supposed to be that funny, right? I'm not just laughing because I don't understand cultural stuff or something like that, right?
No, they definitely are supposed to be funny. Although it's sort of interesting, I think that in the early part of his career, his films were, when they were screened in an international setting, audiences would laugh quite a bit. They'd find it quite funny, whereas Korean audiences were taking it much more seriously. But really starting from his fourth film, Turning Gate, I think this was the one where, I mean, he kind of expanded the humor in his films. And local audiences really do appreciate the humor in his films. I think that it's a really unique kind of humor that is really a big part of his, it's one of his strengths.
I know it's hard being human, but let's not turn into monsters, okay?
Right. Yeah, that's a great quote. He has a lot of just really interesting quotes that surface in his films, and he's very good at writing dialogue. Which is interesting because apparently he doesn't write his screenplays out in advance. Often he'll just kind of he'll have this treatment of 2 or 3 pages that details how the story will develop. And apparently on the day of shooting, he'll go to the set early in the morning and he'll take out a paper and pencil and he'll write out the dialogue for the scene. Even though it might seem to appear spontaneously, he's really a master at dialogue, and you sense a lot of that in English, but for Korean viewers especially, I think that his mastery of dialogue is really kind of unparalleled.
Now, I've only seen about 60 or 70 Korean films, but that's enough to make me a Korean cinema fan, at least in the cinephile circles I run in. And I often kind of try to evangelize in favor of Korean film, but I tend to maybe start in the wrong place. Maybe I shouldn't start with Hong Sang-soo. Where is a good place to start for somebody who maybe listens to this or reads your book and says, geez, there's a lot going on here, and I want to get into Korean film. I'm just sort of afraid of starting at something I won't understand or starting in a non-optimal place. What's a way in that you recommend?
Because Korean cinema is so diverse, I do sometimes have problems giving recommendations to people because I think that different types of people might prefer different places to start. But in general, I think that Bong Joon-ho is the director of The Host. One of his earlier movies, Memories of Murder, and if you're interested in something more quirky, his first film, Barking Dogs Never Bite. And I think these are films that you can really appreciate them on a cinematic level. And although in one sense they're quite difficult, and the things they're saying about Korean society are quite detailed and complex, you can just step back and really enjoy them as films. I mean, his mastery of the art of cinema is quite impressive. And so often I send people sort of towards Bong Joon-ho. But really, I think that there's so many interesting films that I think I always have a hard time kind of giving my own personal suggestions.
And finally, I want to run this by you, just based on the sort of limited knowledge of Korean cinema that I have. Even based on that, I will say to people, I know maybe you haven't seen Korean films before, but check these out. This is just the tip of the iceberg. It's like now is the time for the boom in Korean cinema worldwide, and you get in on it now because it's just beginning, and there's going to be so much more. And forget those other countries you're watching. It's going to be all about Korea for the next 20 years. Maybe it sounds a little exaggerated, but what's your take? Is it? Are we in the middle of the big time for international Korean cinema? Or are we maybe at the very beginning or or maybe the end of it? Maybe it's winding down. I don't know. What's your perspective on what are your expectations, I guess, for Korean cinema?
It is a very interesting time, and my impression is that the industry is kind of fragmenting in a sense, where you have certain directors who are achieving this international recognition. And so Park Chan-wook, Bong Joon-ho, Kim Ji-young, and these directors seem to be moving kind of towards becoming international auteurs. And interestingly, the three directors who I just mentioned, their next films will all be either mostly or completely in English.
Wow.
And I think that in some sense they may look at, people talk about the three amigos from Mexico, Iñárritu. I think that they may be looking at these three Mexican directors as kind of inspiration. Although I think that they'll probably continue to, if they go to Hollywood, to move back and forth between Korea and Hollywood, or to make Hollywood international target films in Korea. These directors seem to be moving in that direction. At the same time, their low-budget independent filmmaking is really expanding at a surprising pace in Korea. The number of low-budget films that are being shot is really quite extraordinary. And you have to kind of sift through a lot of them to get to the really interesting ones, but for people who really follow that, I think there are new, interesting directors making these very low-budget independent films each year. Where people are less optimistic, I think, is kind of like the middle of the industry. I think that whereas a few years ago, this was the heart of the industry, kind of the mid-budget, either genre films or kind of films that kind of focused on particular historical or social issues. There are less of these type of films being made these days. And so I do get the sense that the Korean cinema is kind of splitting up into these different camps, where you have the directors who are already famous, who are kind of continuing to get more famous and more internationally recognized. And then the low-budget end of the industry, which is expanding very quickly, but the middle is collapsing to a certain extent.
Well, as long as some experimentation goes on, I'll be happy. The name of the book, once again, is New Korean Cinema, Breaking the Waves, and the site, of course, is Koreanfilm.org. Darcy Paquet, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show today.
Okay, thank you.
If you'd like to learn more about Darcy Paquet and Korean film, of course, visit Koreanfilm.org. This has been The Marketplace of Ideas, and I've been Colin Marshall. Want to hear the show again? Visit ColinMarshallRadio.com, the official website of the Marketplace of Ideas and the host of the complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive. The website of Ben Althouse, the man who made our theme music, is available too at benalthouse.com. Questions, comments, guest suggestions, any kind of feedback, send that along without delay to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at ColinMarshallRadio.com. As always, thank you for tuning in. We'll catch you next time on the Marketplace of Ideas for more cultural conversation of the depth you demand.